Vicious bikers mock a lone traveler. The secret he reveals silences them instantly. The desert road stretched endlessly into the horizon, shimmering under the relentless sun. Dust swirled in the air as a lone traveler walked, his worn boots crunching against the gravel. A tattered leather backpack hung from his shoulders, and his rugged jacket bore the signs of countless miles. He wasn't in a hurry. His steps were measured, his posture calm. The kind of calm that carried weight, the kind born from someone who had seen more than his fair share of battles, both inside and out. In the distance, the faint roar of engines began to rise. The traveler paused, lifting his head slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he spotted a cloud of dust approaching fast. A pack of motorcycles tore through the stillness, their chrome glinting like fangs under the sun. The sound grew deafening as they surrounded him, engines rumbling like an impending storm. The leader of the group, a burly man with a grizzled beard and a leather vest adorned with patches, cut the engine of his bike and smirked as he stepped forward. Well, what do we have here?" His voice was mocking, loud enough for the other bikers to laugh in unison. The traveler didn't flinch. He stood straight, his gaze steady as it moved from one biker to the next. "Just passing through," he said simply, his voice low and even. The leader laughed, his boots kicking up dust as he walked a slow circle around the traveler. "Passing through, huh? You picked the wrong road for that, friend. This is our territory." "Didn't see any signs," the traveler replied, his tone still calm. The leader stopped in front of him, his smirk twisting into something more menacing. "You don't need signs when everyone knows who runs this stretch of road. And you don't look like you belong." The bikers laughed again, their jeers echoing across the empty landscape. One of them revved his engine, sending a cloud of exhaust into the air. The traveler shifted his weight slightly, his stance casual yet grounded. "I'm not looking for trouble," he said. "Just heading to the next town." "Trouble's already found you, pal," another biker called out, his grin wide and mean. "The question is, what are you gonna do about it?" The leader leaned closer, his voice dropping into a growl. "What's in the bag, huh? Got something worth sharing?" The traveler met his gaze, unflinching. "Just some clothes, food, and water." The leader snorted. "Yeah? Let's see for ourselves." Two bikers moved to grab the traveler's bag, but before they could lay a hand on it, the traveler spoke, his voice sharp and commanding. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The sudden shift in his tone froze the bikers in their tracks. The leader raised an eyebrow, his smirk returning. "Oh, tough guy, huh? And what are you gonna do? Take us all on?" The traveler didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly shrugged off his backpack, setting it gently on the ground. He straightened, rolling his shoulders as he locked eyes with the leader. "I'll only say this once," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Walk away." The bikers roared with laughter, the sound filling the air like a pack of hyenas. The leader clapped his hands, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered, outmatched, and way out of your league." The traveler didn't move, didn't flinch. He let their laughter die down before he spoke again. "You sure about that?" The leader stepped closer, his face inches from the traveler's. "You think you're some kind of big deal?" The traveler's gaze didn't waver. "I'm the kind of deal that's bigger than you want to mess with." Something in his tone, in the calm confidence of his words, made the laughter falter. The leader's smirk slipped just slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "What's that supposed to mean?" The traveler reached into his jacket pocket slowly, deliberately. The bikers tensed, their hands inching toward their weapons. But instead of a gun or knife, the traveler pulled out a small, weathered badge. He held it up for all to see, the sunlight catching the metal as the word Special Forces glinted in their eyes. The leader's face paled slightly, his bravado cracking. The traveler's voice was quiet but carried an undeniable authority. "I've seen men tougher than you break under pressure. And I've handled situations a lot worse than this one. So I'll say it again, walk away." The silence that followed was heavy, the tension palpable. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence slipping away like sand through their fingers. The leader's jaw tightened, his pride warring with his instincts. Finally, he stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "All right, soldier boy. You win this round." But don't think we'll forget this. The traveler picked up his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. I'm counting on it. One by one, the bikers climbed back onto their motorcycles, their engines roaring to life. The leader gave the traveler one last glare before turning his bike around. The pack rode off, their bravado muted, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. As the sound of engines faded, the traveler stood alone once more, the road stretching ahead of him. He adjusted his backpack, took a deep breath, and continued walking, his steps steady and unshaken. The traveler continued his journey down the sun-baked road, the encounter with the bikers already slipping into the recesses of his mind. His steps remained steady, each crunch of gravel underfoot a reminder that he still had miles to go before reaching the next town. The heat pressed down on him like a weight, but he didn't waver. Behind him, the faint rumble of engines returned, growing louder by the second. He didn't stop walking, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He had been expecting this. The roar of motorcycles filled the air as the gang returned, this time riding in tighter formation. The leader pulled ahead, his bike screeching to a halt in front of the traveler, kicking up a plume of dust. The others surrounded him again, their expressions harder, more menacing than before. I thought we were done, the traveler said, his voice calm but edged with steel. The leader dismounted, his boots crunching against the dirt as he approached. You thought wrong, he said, his voice low and cold. You embarrassed me back there. Made me look weak in front of my men. I can't let that slide. The traveler let out a slow breath, his gaze steady. You're making a mistake. The leader sneered, pulling a knife from his belt and twirling it in his hand. No, the mistake was letting you walk away the first time. Now, I'm gonna make sure you don't forget who runs this road. The other bikers dismounted, forming a loose circle around the traveler. Their jeers filled the air, their confidence bolstered by their numbers. But the traveler remained calm. He set his backpack down again, his movements deliberate, unhurried. Last chance, he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that cut through the noise. Turn around and leave. The leader laughed, his knife gleaming in the sunlight. You don't get it, do you? There's no walking away from this. The traveler straightened, his posture shifting subtly. He was no longer a weary man on a long journey. He was something else now, something sharper, more dangerous. His eyes, once calm, now held an intensity that made even the most confident biker hesitate. I was hoping you'd say that, the traveler said, his voice low and steady. The leader lunged, the knife flashing toward the traveler. But before it could connect, the traveler moved, fast, fluid, like a predator striking. He sidestepped the attack with ease, his hand shooting out to grab the leader's wrist. A quick, precise twist, and the knife clattered to the ground. The other bikers froze, their jeers dying in their throats as they watched their leader stumble back, clutching his wrist in pain. The traveler didn't give him a chance to recover. He stepped forward, his movements efficient and controlled, and swept the leader's legs out from under him. The leader hit the ground hard, gasping as the air was knocked from his lungs. The traveler crouched beside him, his voice low and cold. You don't want to do this. One of the bikers snapped out of his shock and charged, swinging a chain toward the traveler. Without looking, the traveler rose and caught the chain mid-swing, yanking it from the biker's hands and sending him sprawling. The rest of the gang hesitated, their confidence shaken. The traveler turned to face them, the chain dangling loosely in his hand. Anyone else? The gang exchanged uneasy glances. They outnumbered him, but it was clear that numbers didn't mean much against someone like him. The leader groaned from the ground, struggling to sit up. Get him, he barked, his voice weak but commanding. Two more bikers rushed forward, one swinging a crowbar, the other raising a bat. The traveler moved like water, fluid and unstoppable. He disarmed the first attacker with a swift kick to the wrist, the crowbar falling harmlessly to the ground. The second attacker swung the bat, but the traveler ducked under the blow and delivered a precise strike to the man's midsection, sending him doubling over. Within moments, the gang's bravado crumbled. Those who hadn't fought stood frozen, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. The traveler straightened, his breathing steady, his expression calm. This is over, he said, his voice firm. Walk away. Now, The leader, still on the ground, glared up at him, his pride shattered. Who are you? The traveler leaned down, his gaze piercing. I'm the guy who just gave you a second chance. Don't waste it. The leader swallowed hard, his bravado completely gone. He motioned to his men, his voice shaking. Let's go. The bikers hurried to their motorcycles, their earlier confidence replaced by a desperate need to escape. Engines roared to life, and one by one, they rode off, leaving the traveler alone on the dusty road once more. He stood there for a moment, watching the cloud of dust fade into the distance. Then he picked up his backpack, slinging it over his shoulder. His steps were as steady as ever as he continued down the road, the sun dipping lower on the horizon. In the distance, the outline of the next town began to take shape, its lights twinkling faintly against the fading daylight. The traveler's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. He had miles behind him and still more ahead. But for now, the road was his, and the silence was golden. The lone traveler reached the outskirts of the small town just as twilight settled in. The lights from the main street cast a warm glow against the darkening sky, and the hum of distant voices and occasional laughter added life to the quiet surroundings. The traveler adjusted the strap of his backpack and continued walking, his boots stirring the dusty road. He passed by a row of modest houses, their porches adorned with potted plants and old rocking chairs. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, but the traveler paid no mind. His focus was on the neon sign flickering at the end of the street. Jake's Diner, open 24/7. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The diner was small but welcoming, with red leather booths and the faint smell of coffee and fried food lingering in the air. A few patrons glanced his way, a truck driver nursing a cup of coffee, a young couple sharing a plate of fries, but most returned to their conversations without much interest. The traveler approached the counter and slid onto a stool. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with a kind face and a name tag that read Linda, greeted him with a warm smile. "What can I get you, hon?" she asked, placing a menu in front of him. "Just coffee, black," the traveler replied, his voice calm but tired. Linda nodded and poured him a steaming cup. "Passing through?" she asked, her curiosity evident. "Yeah," he said, taking a sip. The warmth of the coffee seemed to ease the tension in his body. "You don't look like the usual folks who come through here," Linda said, leaning against the counter. "Got a story?" The traveler smiled faintly. "Don't we all?" Linda chuckled. "Fair enough. Well, if you're hungry, the burgers here are the best in town." "I'll keep that in mind," he said, his tone polite but non-committal. As he sipped his coffee, the door jingled again. A group of men walked in, their presence immediately commanding attention. They weren't bikers, but their rough demeanor and loud voices suggested they weren't strangers to trouble. One of them, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, glanced around the diner before locking eyes with the traveler. The man smirked and nudged his companions. "Looks like we've got ourselves a wanderer." The traveler didn't react. He kept his gaze on his coffee, his posture relaxed but alert. Linda, sensing the tension, quickly stepped in. "You boys want a table or the counter?" "We'll take a booth," the scarred man said, his eyes still fixed on the traveler. The group settled into a booth near the window, their voices carrying across the diner as they ordered beers and food. Linda leaned closer to the traveler, her voice low. "Don't mind them. They're all talk." "I'm not worried," the traveler said, his tone calm. But the scarred man wasn't done. He stood up and sauntered over to the counter, his boots thudding against the tiled floor. He stopped beside the traveler, his grin widening. "What brings you to our little town?" "Just passing through," the traveler replied, not looking up. The scarred man chuckled. "Passing through, huh? You know, strangers don't always get a warm welcome around here." The traveler finally met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "Seems warm enough to me." The scarred man leaned closer, his grin fading slightly. "You got a smart mouth. That can get you in trouble." The diner grew quiet, the other patrons watching the interaction with a mix of curiosity and unease. Linda started to step forward, but the traveler raised a hand, stopping her. "I'm not looking for trouble," the traveler said, his voice steady. "But if you bring it, I'll handle it." The scarred man laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Oh, you'll handle it, huh? You got no idea who you're messing with?" The traveler set down his coffee and turned to face the man fully. "I could say the same to you." For a moment, the scarred man hesitated, as if sensing the quiet confidence radiating from the traveler. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached out, grabbing the traveler's jacket collar. Before anyone could react, the traveler moved. His hand shot up, gripping the scarred man's wrist in an iron hold. With a single fluid motion, he twisted the man's arm and forced him to his knees. The man let out a pained grunt, his companions leaping to their feet. "Stop!" Linda shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. "Take it outside now." The traveler released the man, who stumbled back, cradling his arm. He glared at the traveler, his face red with anger and humiliation. "This ain't over," he growled before storming out of the diner with his companions following closely behind. The traveler sighed and picked up his coffee, taking another sip as if nothing had happened. Linda shook her head, a mix of frustration and admiration in her expression. "You've got a way of stirring things up," she said. "Wasn't my intention," the traveler replied. "Well, they'll be waiting for you outside, you know," Linda said, her tone warning. The traveler nodded. "I know." He finished his coffee, left a few bills on the counter, and stood. As he walked to the door, Linda called after him. "Be careful, hon." The traveler glanced back, offering her a faint smile. "Always." The night air was cool as he stepped outside. The group of men was waiting, their silhouettes outlined by the dim glow of the streetlights. The scarred man stepped forward, his expression dark. "You're gonna regret that," he snarled. The traveler adjusted his backpack and squared his shoulders. "I've heard that before." And with that, the silence of the small town was shattered once again. The scarred man and his group spread out, forming a loose circle around the traveler. The quiet hum of the night was broken only by the occasional hiss of the wind, carrying the faint creak of a distant sign swaying in the breeze. The traveler stood still, his gaze sweeping over the men one by one. There was no fear in his eyes, only the calm resolve of someone who had been here before, too many times to count. The scarred man cracked his knuckles, his companions grinning as if the outcome was already decided. "This ain't the diner now," the man sneered. "No one to stop us." The traveler set his backpack down slowly, his movements deliberate. He straightened, rolling his shoulders, his stance shifting into something subtly more defensive. "I gave you a chance back there," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm giving you another one now. Walk away." The scarred man's grin twisted into a snarl. "You don't get it, do you? This is our town, and we don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and acting like they own the place." "I'm not here to own anything," the traveler replied, his tone even. "I'm just passing through. But if you want to make this your business, I won't stop you." One of the men, emboldened by the traveler's calm demeanor, lunged first. He swung a metal pipe, aiming for the traveler's side. But the traveler moved faster than anyone expected. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The pipe clattered to the ground, and the man stumbled back, clutching his arm in pain. The other men hesitated for a moment, exchanging uneasy glances. But the scarred man barked, "Get him!" 3 of them charged at once. The traveler dropped low, sweeping one man's legs out from under him before pivoting to block a punch from another. His movements were efficient, precise, a masterful blend of defense and offense. Within seconds, 2 more men were on the ground, groaning in pain. The scarred man stepped forward, pulling a switchblade from his pocket. The blade gleamed under the streetlight as he flicked it open, his expression dark. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he growled. "You don't scare me." The traveler's gaze locked onto the blade, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't need to scare you. I just need you to stop." The scarred man lunged, slashing the blade toward the traveler's chest. But the traveler sidestepped with almost supernatural grace, his hand shooting out to grab the man's wrist. With a quick twist, he disarmed the scarred man, sending the blade spinning to the ground. Before the scarred man could recover, the traveler stepped forward, his hand gripping the man's collar. He shoved him against the wall of the diner, the force of the impact rattling the nearby window. "Enough," the traveler said, his voice quiet but filled with authority. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm not here to take anything from you. But if you come at me again, you'll regret it." The scarred man stared at him, his defiance wavering as he realized just how outmatched he was. His chest heaved as he tried to speak, but no words came out. The traveler released him, stepping back. "Take your men. Go home. And think about what you're doing with your lives." The scarred man staggered, looking around at his fallen companions. He opened his mouth to speak but thought better of it. Instead, he nodded to his men, who scrambled to their feet and limped away, casting uneasy glances back at the traveler. As the group disappeared into the shadows, the traveler retrieved his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. He turned toward the diner, where Linda stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," the traveler replied, his tone as calm as ever. Linda stepped closer, her eyes scanning him for any sign of injury. "Who are you really?" The traveler paused, considering her question. Finally, he said, "Just someone trying to keep the peace." With that, he turned and began walking down the street, the faint glow of the town's lights fading behind him as he headed toward the open road. The night was quiet once more, the air cool against his skin. His steps were steady, unhurried, as though he carried all the time in the world. In the distance, the faint outline of the next horizon began to take shape. The traveler adjusted his backpack and kept moving, his purpose clear and his path his own. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and though the journey was far from over, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what came his way, he would meet it head-on, with calm, with strength, and with the unshakable resolve of someone who had already walked through fire and come out stronger. The open road lay ahead, endless and quiet, but the traveler's mind was far from still. Each step felt heavier now, not from exhaustion but from the weight of the encounters he left behind. He wasn't a man who sought conflict, but it seemed to find him all the same. The dust of the town clung to his boots as the horizon drew him forward. The moon climbed higher in the sky, bathing the landscape in silver light. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hoot of an owl echoed, accompanied by the whisper of the wind. The road was deserted, as most roads were at this hour, but the traveler's senses remained sharp. Years of living on edge had conditioned him to be alert, even when the world seemed calm. A sound broke the stillness, a faint rumble, low and distant. He stopped, turning slightly, his sharp gaze scanning the road behind him. The rumble grew louder, more distinct. Engines. More than one. He tightened the strap of his backpack and exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cool night air. The headlights appeared first, two beams cutting through the darkness. Then another pair. And another. Soon, a convoy of motorcycles came into view, their growling engines filling the night with a menacing roar. The traveler stood his ground, his expression unreadable, as the bikes slowed and encircled him like wolves closing in on prey. A familiar figure dismounted from the lead bike, the scarred man. His face was twisted in anger and humiliation, a bruise forming on his jaw from their earlier encounter. This time, he wasn't alone. The group had grown larger, at least a dozen strong, their leather jackets glinting in the moonlight. "You didn't think we'd let you walk away, did you?" The scarred man sneered, his voice dripping with venom. The traveler didn't respond immediately. He looked at each biker, assessing them, noting their weapons, a mix of chains, bats, and knives. Finally, he said, "You brought reinforcements. Smart." The scarred man's grin widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Smart enough to take you down this time. No more games?" The traveler shifted his weight slightly, his stance remaining calm but ready. "I don't want to hurt anyone. But if you force me, I won't hold back." The bikers laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that filled the air. The scarred man motioned to his group. "Let's teach this guy what happens when you mess with us." The first biker charged, swinging a chain with a fierce roar. The traveler sidestepped, his movements precise and controlled, and grabbed the chain mid-swing. With a sharp tug, he yanked the biker off balance, sending him sprawling to the ground. Another came at him with a bat, aiming for his ribs. The traveler caught the bat with one hand, twisting it out of the biker's grip before delivering a calculated kick to his knee, sending him crumpling in pain. The bat clattered to the ground as the traveler stepped back, his breathing steady. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. The scarred man growled, his frustration boiling over. "What are you waiting for? Get him!" They attacked together this time, a coordinated assault that would have overwhelmed most people. But the traveler wasn't most people. He moved with the precision of someone who had been trained to survive, to win. His strikes were deliberate, efficient, each movement neutralizing a threat without unnecessary violence. The moonlight reflected off a blade as one biker lunged at him from behind. The traveler spun, his arm deflecting the knife before delivering a swift elbow to the man's temple. Another biker swung a pipe, but the traveler ducked, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. Within moments, the fight was over. The bikers lay scattered across the road, groaning and clutching their injuries. The traveler stood in the center, unscathed, his breathing calm. His gaze shifted to the scarred man, who hadn't joined the fight. The man's hands trembled as he reached for the knife on his belt. The traveler took a step forward, his voice low and firm. "Don't." The scarred man froze, his hand hovering over the knife. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. The traveler stepped closer, his presence commanding. "This is done," the traveler said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Walk away. Go home. And stop looking for fights you can't win." The scarred man swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the traveler's gaze. He nodded stiffly, his voice barely above a whisper. "All right, we're done." He turned to his men, his voice rising. "Get up. We're leaving." One by one, the bikers struggled to their feet, limping toward their motorcycles. Engines sputtered to life, and the group rode off into the night, their figures disappearing into the darkness. The traveler watched them go, his expression unreadable. He picked up his backpack and adjusted the strap, glancing at the road ahead. The silence returned, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind. He started walking again, his steps steady and unhurried. In the distance, the faint glow of a new town began to appear on the horizon. He didn't know what awaited him there, but it didn't matter. Whatever came next, he was ready. The road stretched endlessly before him, and with each step, the traveler moved forward, not just toward a destination, but toward something greater. A purpose. A peace that could only be found by continuing the journey, 1 mile at a time. The horizon was painted with faint streaks of orange and purple as dawn began to break, signaling the end of another long night. The traveler walked in silence, his shadow stretching before him as the first rays of sunlight kissed the earth. His mind wandered briefly to the events of the past day, the bikers, the diner, and the tension that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But he didn't dwell. He never did. The road ahead demanded his focus, and he gave it willingly. As the town came into clearer view, he noticed its modest size. A single main street flanked by low buildings with weathered signs advertising general stores, a mechanic's shop, and a small bed and breakfast. The town seemed to be just waking up, with shopkeepers pulling up their shutters and the faint smell of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. The traveler adjusted his backpack and headed toward the general store. Inside, shelves were stocked with basic necessities, cans of food, tools, and a small section of travel supplies. The shopkeeper, an older man with a kind face, greeted him with a nod. "Morning," the shopkeeper said, his voice gruff but friendly. "Passing through?" "Morning," the traveler replied. "Yeah, just stocking up." The shopkeeper nodded again and went back to arranging items on a shelf. The traveler grabbed a few things, a bottle of water, some canned goods, and a small roll of bandages. As he placed the items on the counter, the shopkeeper studied him for a moment. "Looks like you've seen some action," the man said, motioning toward the faint scuff marks on the traveler's jacket and the subtle bruises on his knuckles. The traveler offered a faint smile. "Comes with the territory." The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "Well, this town's quiet for the most part. Folks here don't like trouble." "Neither do I," the traveler replied, placing a few bills on the counter. The shopkeeper handed him his change, then paused. "You might want to stop by the diner down the road. Mary serves the best breakfast around these parts." "I'll keep that in mind," the traveler said, slipping the supplies into his backpack. Thanks. He stepped out of the store, the warmth of the sun on his face as he scanned the quiet street. His stomach grumbled, and for the first time in hours, he realized just how hungry he was. The mention of breakfast sounded appealing, so he turned toward the diner. The diner was a small, cozy establishment with a few booths lining the windows and a counter with swivel stools. A bell jingled as he stepped inside, and a woman behind the counter, presumably Mary, looked up and smiled. "Good morning," she said. "Grab a seat anywhere." The traveler chose a stool at the counter, setting his backpack on the floor beside him. Mary poured him a cup of coffee without asking, setting it in front of him with a knowing smile. "You look like you could use this." "Thanks," he said, taking a sip. The coffee was strong and comforting, cutting through the lingering fatigue. "What'll it be?" Mary asked, flipping open her notepad. "Whatever's hot," the traveler replied. Mary chuckled. "Coming right up." As he waited, the traveler let his gaze wander. The diner was quiet, save for the soft hum of a radio playing an old country song in the background. A few locals sat at booths, chatting quietly over their meals. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost disarmingly so. Mary returned a few minutes later with a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast. The traveler nodded his thanks and dug in, the warmth of the food spreading through him like a balm. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax, if only slightly. "You're not from around here," Mary said, leaning against the counter. "Just passing through," the traveler replied, his default answer. Mary tilted her head, studying him. "We don't get many strangers around here. But when we do, they're usually running from something or looking for something." The traveler looked up, his fork paused midair. "What makes you think I'm either?" Mary shrugged, her smile kind but knowing. "Call it a hunch. You've got that look, like you've seen too much and don't know where you're going next." He set his fork down, leaning back slightly. "Maybe I just like the road." Mary nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe, but the road doesn't usually give back what it takes." The traveler didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to. Instead, he picked up his coffee and took another sip, the warmth of it grounding him. As he finished his meal, Mary refilled his coffee and handed him a small paper bag. "For the road," she said with a wink. "Can't have you going hungry." The traveler accepted the bag with a nod. "Thanks." Mary smiled. "Safe travels, stranger. And if you ever find what you're looking for, I hope it's worth it." The traveler slipped the bag into his backpack and stepped outside, the sound of the bell jingling behind him. The day was warmer now, the sun climbing higher in the sky. He adjusted his pack and started walking again, the town fading behind him as the open road stretched out before him once more. As he walked, Mary's words echoed in his mind. The road doesn't usually give back what it takes. He didn't know if she was right, but for now, the road was all he had. And that was enough. The road stretched out endlessly before him, the distant hum of life fading behind as the traveler moved forward. His boots crunched against the gravel, the sound oddly comforting in the stillness of the open landscape. The sun had risen higher now, casting sharp shadows along the highway. He could feel the heat building, radiating off the asphalt, but he didn't slow his pace. Mary's words still lingered in his mind. The road doesn't usually give back what it takes. He wasn't sure why they struck a chord with him. Maybe because they were true. He glanced down the road and spotted a small hill in the distance. A lone tree stood at its crest, its gnarled branches offering a modest patch of shade. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He quickened his pace, the thought of rest pulling him forward. When he reached the tree, he dropped his backpack to the ground and sat with his back against the trunk. The shade was a welcome relief, the coolness of the ground seeping through his jacket. He pulled out the paper bag Mary had given him and opened it to find a sandwich, an apple, and a small bottle of water. Simple, but enough to satisfy the hunger that still lingered. As he ate, his eyes wandered to the horizon. The landscape was vast and empty, a sea of muted browns and yellows stretching endlessly in every direction. The solitude was familiar, even comforting in its way. But it also carried a weight, a reminder of the miles he'd already traveled and the countless more that lay ahead. A sudden rustling sound pulled him from his thoughts. He tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his side where a blade rested hidden beneath his jacket. His sharp eyes scanned the area, landing on a figure approaching from the opposite direction. It was a man, older and hunched with the wear of a life lived hard. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a walking stick, his steps deliberate but slow. The traveler watched him for a moment, assessing, before easing his hand away from the blade. The man didn't seem like a threat. The stranger stopped a few feet away, tipping his hat in greeting. "Mind if I share the shade?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. The traveler nodded. "Go ahead." The man eased himself to the ground with a groan, leaning his walking stick against the tree. He pulled a canteen from his belt and took a long sip before glancing at the traveler. "Long road behind you?" "Longer one ahead," the traveler replied. The man chuckled. "Ain't that the truth? Funny thing about roads, they don't seem to care much about where you've been or where you're going." The traveler offered a faint smile but didn't respond. He wasn't in the habit of sharing much with strangers, but there was something about the old man's presence that felt disarming. "You got the look of someone who's seen a lot," the man continued, his tone thoughtful. "And lost even more." The traveler's jaw tightened slightly. "You make a habit of reading people?" "Just the ones who stop to sit under the same tree," the man said with a shrug. "Out here, you learn to see what others don't say." The traveler leaned back against the tree, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "What do you see then?" The man studied him for a long moment, his eyes sharp despite his age. "I see a man carrying more than what's in that backpack. I see someone who's been running, but not from something, from himself." The traveler's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer, but his silence seemed to confirm the man's words. The old man nodded, as if satisfied. "Well, I'll tell you this much, whatever it is you're looking for, you ain't gonna find it on this road." The traveler frowned, his gaze shifting to the man. "What makes you so sure?" "Because roads like this, they don't lead to answers," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. "They lead to more questions. The answers, they're in here." He tapped his chest. "Always have been." The traveler let the words sink in, his mind turning them over. He wanted to dismiss them, to brush off the man's insight as the ramblings of someone who didn't know him. But deep down he couldn't. The man pushed himself to his feet with a grunt, brushing off the dust from his pants. "Well, I've taken enough of your shade," he said, tipping his hat again. "Good luck, stranger. I hope you find what you're looking for." Without waiting for a response, the old man picked up his walking stick and started down the road, his steps slow but steady. The traveler watched him go, a strange mix of curiosity and unease stirring in his chest. After a moment, he packed up what was left of the food, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and stood. The road stretched out before him, unchanged but somehow different in his eyes. He started walking again, the man's words echoing in his mind. "The answers, they're in here. Always have been." For the first time in a long while, the traveler allowed himself to wonder, what if the road wasn't the solution, but the distraction? What if everything he sought had been within him all along? The question stayed with him as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the horizon beckoning him forward. The journey continued, but now, it felt less like an escape and more like a search, for himself, for peace, for whatever lay beyond the endless miles ahead. The traveler walked on, the old man's words gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Each step felt heavier now, not from the weight of his pack but from the questions he could no longer ignore. What had he been running from? And why did he keep moving even when the road offered no clear answers? The landscape began to change as the sun climbed higher. The barren plains gave way to sparse patches of greenery, and the faint sound of running water reached his ears. Up ahead, he saw a small creek winding its way through the land. The traveler paused, crouching by the edge of the water to refill his canteen. The coolness of the creek was a welcome reprieve from the relentless heat. As he drank, he noticed something unusual, a set of footprints in the soft earth near the water's edge. They were fresh, leading away from the creek and into a grove of trees nearby. The traveler straightened, his eyes narrowing. Someone else was here. He followed the tracks cautiously, his footsteps quiet against the damp ground. The grove was dense, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in scattered patches. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. The tracks led to a small clearing, where a woman sat on a fallen log, her back to him. She appeared to be in her early 30s, her clothes worn but clean. A large canvas bag sat at her feet, and she was carefully wrapping what looked like a sprained ankle with a piece of cloth. She hadn't noticed him yet, her attention focused on her task. The traveler cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. She reached for a stick lying nearby, gripping it tightly as she stood on one foot, balancing against the log. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Just a traveler," he said, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. "I saw the footprints. Thought someone might need help." The woman's grip on the stick relaxed slightly, though she didn't lower it. "I'm fine," she said. "Don't need help?" The traveler nodded, keeping his distance. "All right, but that ankle doesn't look fine." She hesitated, glancing down at her wrapped ankle before looking back at him. "What do you want?" "Nothing," he said simply. "Just passing through." Her eyes narrowed, studying him for a long moment. Finally, she sighed and lowered the stick, easing herself back onto the log. "Sorry," she muttered. "Can't be too careful out here." "Understandable," the traveler replied, stepping closer but still keeping a respectful distance. "How'd it happen?" "Tripped on a root," she said, her tone clipped. "Stupid mistake." The traveler crouched a few feet away, setting his backpack down. "Do you have supplies?" The woman gestured to her bag. "Some. Enough." He nodded, reaching into his own pack. He pulled out the roll of bandages he'd bought earlier and held them out. "These might help." She hesitated, eyeing him warily before taking the bandages. "Thanks," she said, her voice softening slightly. As she worked on rewrapping her ankle, the traveler leaned back against a tree, watching her carefully. There was something about her, something familiar in the guarded way she carried herself, in the shadows behind her eyes. He recognized it because he'd seen it in himself. "You're not from around here," he said after a moment. She glanced up at him, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Neither are you." "Fair enough," he replied. "Where are you headed?" "Not sure yet," she said, tying off the bandage. "Just away." "From what?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at her ankle, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the bandage. "From everything," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The traveler nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. "The road's good for that," he said. "Yeah," she said, her tone bitter. "Until it isn't." He tilted his head slightly, her words striking a chord. "Why do you say that?" She looked up at him, her gaze sharp. "Because no matter how far you go, you can't outrun what's inside you." The traveler's breath caught, the old man's words echoing in his mind. "The answers, they're in here. Always have been." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, though, it was shared, an understanding born from mutual experience. Finally, the traveler stood, brushing off his hands. "You need to get that ankle looked at," he said. "There's a town a few miles down the road. They might have a clinic." The woman nodded, adjusting the strap on her bag. "Thanks for the bandages." "Take care," he said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Hey." He glanced back, his brow raised. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Just a traveler." She smirked faintly. "Well, thanks, traveler." He gave her a small nod before continuing on his way. The grove fell silent behind him, but her words stayed with him, weaving themselves into the fabric of his thoughts. No matter how far you go, you can't outrun what's inside you. The road stretched ahead, as endless and unyielding as ever. But for the first time in a long while, the traveler wondered if the answers he sought were closer than he realized. Perhaps they weren't at the end of the road, but somewhere along it, waiting to be found, if only he had the courage to look.